January 1945. A snowy, cratered field outside Bastogne. Exhausted American soldiers stand in straight lines, their breath freezing in the winter air. Patton tripods are being leveled, and press photographers are wiping frost from their lenses to capture a grand victory ceremony. But out in the freezing mud, away from the dry ground, a group of combat-weary tankers is being forced to step out of the main formation. A proud officer points them toward the dark shadows of a nearby motor pool, intentionally hiding them behind a row of heavy supply trucks. Their faces are smeared with grease and dried blood, their uniforms torn by shrapnel, but their presence is deemed an embarrassment for the cameras. They are being completely erased from the victory they just bought with their own flesh. But General George S. Patton is on his way, and he is about to ensure that those who bled in the snow will not be hidden in the dark. This is the story of how General George S. Patton confronted a public relations officer who tried to erase black heroes from history, and how he forced the military hierarchy to acknowledge the brave men who saved his flank. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show what happened when prejudice met consequences. Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers was 23 years old. He came from the flat, wind-swept fields of Oklahoma. He belonged to the 761st Tank Battalion, a unit known across the European theater as the Black Panthers. Before shipping overseas, Rivers had worked the dirt to help his family survive. He enlisted because he believed that courage on the battlefield would earn his people the respect they deserved at home. In the freezing mud of France and Belgium, he had seen his friends burn inside shattered Sherman tanks. Just days earlier, an enemy shell had torn through his vehicle, embedding jagged iron shrapnel deep into his thigh. His uniform was dark with oil, grease, and his own dried blood. He refused to be evacuated to a field hospital, choosing instead to stay with his surviving crew. Now he leaned heavily against a crude wooden cane, his jaw clenched against the throbbing pain. Standing quietly at the very edge of the snowy assembly area, Colonel Richard Smythe was 45 years old and served as a senior public relations officer from New York. He had spent the war inside warm, well-lit headquarters, far behind the firing lines. His boots were buffed to a mirror shine. His wool coat was custom-tailored, free of mud, dirt, or gunpowder stains. Smythe did not care about tactical victories, flank defense, or the men who held the line. He cared exclusively about the newsreels sent across the Atlantic. He firmly believed the domestic population was not prepared to see non-white soldiers celebrated as frontline heroes. In his mind, public support for the war effort depended on preserving familiar social hierarchies. He moved briskly across the frozen field, adjusting the positions of the camera tripods and directing reporters. He treated the wounded tankers of the 761st like invisible laborers, ordering them out of sight to ensure they remained entirely out of the frame. It was January 1945. A snowy, cratered field outside Bastogne lay frozen under a gray sky. Exhausted soldiers stand in neat rows, their boots sinking into the slush as a military band tunes its instruments for an official victory ceremony. Camera tripods are hammered into the icy mud. Flashbulbs are lined up on wooden crates. Then comes the insult. A public relations officer steps forward, clipboard in hand, and orders a group of heavily bandaged, shivering tankers out of the main formation. He tells them to move backward, deep into the shadows, near the grease-stained trucks of the motor pool, so the arriving reporters will not see them. He wants them completely hidden from history. But the general is already on his way. George S. Patton Jr. is about to give this arrogant officer a terrifying choice that will drag those forgotten heroes right back into the light. Captain Arthur Vance, a 31-year-old company commander from Chicago with the 4th Armored Division, noticed the relocation immediately. He walked over to the edge of the motor pool, his boots crunching in the dirty slush. He looked at the tankers huddled by the trucks, then looked back at the main stage. "Colonel, what is the meaning of this?" Vance asked. "These men just spent 3 days clearing the southern flank to open this road. They belong in the center of the formation." Colonel Smythe did not look up from his clipboard. He waved a gloved hand toward the arriving press jeeps. They belong exactly where I put them, Captain, Smythe said. This is a public relations operation, not a tactical briefing. I have 3 major newspapers and 2 newsreel crews arriving from Paris. They are here to take pictures of the liberation of Bastogne. The regulations state that all units participating in the breakout are to be cited together, Vance said. His voice was stiff. These men took 60% casualties to hold that ridgeline. Staff Sergeant Rivers should be at the head of the line. Regulations do not dictate public morale, Smythe answered. He finally looked at Vance, his eyes narrow and cold. The folks back home are buying war bonds to support this army. They want to see the boys they recognize. They are not ready to see black tankers being handed silver stars by a 3-star general. It creates a narrative complication we do not need. My job is to manage the image of this command, and I will not have that image compromised by your sentimentality. Captain Vance clenched his fists inside his wool gloves. The men heard you, Colonel, Vance said. They are standing right there. They can hear every word you are saying. Then they can hear that they have a job to do, Smythe said. Their job is to maintain those vehicles. The cameras stay focused on the main line. If any of those men move toward the press platform before the general arrives, I will personally file charges for insubordination. This conversation is over. Captain, return to your unit. Vance stood his ground for a fraction of a second, his face burning in the freezing air. He looked at Sergeant Rivers, who remained perfectly still, staring straight ahead into the gray fog. Vance knew this was beyond his authority. He turned around, walked directly to his command vehicle, and picked up the radio handset to report the situation directly up the chain of command. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton arrived within the hour. His open-top Jeep roared through the frozen mud and skidded to a halt right behind the press platform. 4 silver stars gleamed on his helmet, and his signature ivory-handled revolvers rested in their holsters against his thigh. The casual chatter of the reporters died instantly. The military band stopped mid-note. Everyone in the field snapped to attention, their breath misting in the freezing air as the general stepped out onto the packed snow. He did not look at the cameras. He did not look at the pristine rows of white infantrymen. He walked with long, deliberate strides past the entire crowd, his eyes locked entirely on the back of the lot where the dirty tanks stood. He stopped inches away from Colonel Smythe. "Colonel, explain this layout to me," Patton said. "General, we are setting up the optimal angles for the newsreel crews," Smythe answered. He smiled nervously, gesturing to the front ranks. "We have the clean formations positioned right where the light hits the field." "And why are those Shermans parked 300 yards back in the mud?" Patton asked. "Those are just the support elements from the motor pool, General," Smythe said. "They are simply clearing the lane for the main presentation." Patton studied him. His voice remained quiet, but it carried across the silent field. "You call the men who broke the German ring at Bastogne a support element?" "Colonel," Smythe shifted his weight, his polished boots clicking together. "General, the home front requires a specific image for victory. The public expects a traditional look for the front page photographs. We must consider the long-term optics of the army." "You are a fool, Colonel," Patton said. "You stand here in a tailored coat and talk about optics to a man who watches soldiers die. You think the American public is too weak to look at the faces of the men who just saved an entire corps from annihilation. You think a camera care about the color of a man's skin when he is burning alive inside a Sherman tank." Staff Sergeant Rivers and his men did not hide in the shadows. "When the German artillery was tearing the frozen ground apart on my left flank," Patton continued, "they stood in the open. They bled into this very snow while you were sitting in a heated office in Paris, organizing film reels. You have insulted the uniform. You have insulted this command, and you have insulted the brave men who gave their lives so you could stand here safely with your clipboard. I will not have the history of this Third Army written by a coward who is afraid of a photographic negative. You have 2 options, Colonel. Pick one in the next 10 seconds. You will personally walk back to those trucks right now. You will apologize loudly so every man here can hear you, and you will escort Sergeant Rivers and his entire unit to the absolute front row of this formation. Your alternative is to strip those eagles off your shoulders, hand me your sidearm, and begin walking back to the coast on foot. Decide now. Smythe turned pale, his mouth opening slightly as he looked at the hostile faces of the surrounding officers. He looked back at Patton, but the general's face was like stone. Smythe dropped his clipboard into the slush. It was January 1945. A snowy, cratered field outside Bastogne serves as a makeshift stage for a victory celebration. Freezing mud turns to ice under the boots of hundreds of waiting infantrymen. Flashing bulbs from military cameras cut through the gray winter morning light. Suddenly, a sharp command breaks the quiet mood. A public relations officer steps into the clearing, shouting orders to push a specific group of soldiers backward. He demands that a bruised and battered tank crew step completely out of the formation line. He forces them to stand behind the transport trucks, hidden in the shadows of the motor pool. General George S. Patton Jr. is on his way to this exact field. The arrogant officer believes he has successfully hidden the men who actually won the day. He does not know that the general is about to turn his carefully planned cameras directly toward the shadows. January 1945. A snowy, cratered field outside Bastogne. Bitter wind sweeps across the frozen dirt as lines of clean, rested American soldiers stand in crisp formation. Caminar tripods click into place. Flash bulbs catch the gray winter light. This is supposed to be a moment of absolute triumph, a celebration of the lives saved during the brutal winter siege. But 40 yards away, behind the idling supply trucks and the grease-stained mechanics, a small group of black tankers stands in the freezing slush. They are shivering. Their wool coats are torn, stiffened with frozen mud and dried engine oil. They are ordered to stay out of sight, pushed into the shadows near the motor pool, so the lens of history can overlook their bleeding. A senior public relations officer stands before the main stage, waving his gloved hand to push them even further back into the tree line. How Patton honored the segregated tankers who saved his flank at Bastogne is the story of when courage refused to be hidden in the shadows. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show when courage refused to be hidden in the shadows. Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers was 23 years old. He came from Hotchkiss, Oklahoma, and he commanded a Sherman tank in the segregated 761st Tank Battalion, known across the European theater as the Black Panthers. Rivers grew up working the dusty fields of Oklahoma, learning how to mend broken tractors and endure the blistering summer heat before enlisting the day after Pearl Harbor. He had spent the last 3 weeks fighting through knee-deep snow, breathing in black diesel smoke and burning cordite, while his tank cleared German anti-tank positions along the frozen ridges. 2 days ago, a fragment of high-explosive shrapnel sliced through his thigh, opening a deep, jagged gash that oozed dark blood into his boot. He refused to be evacuated. He wrapped the wound in greasy rags, gripped a crude wooden cane carved from a shattered pine branch, and kept his men moving forward through the blizzard. Now, he stood in the freezing mud behind a row of heavy 2-ton trucks, his teeth clenched against the biting pain, watching the clean dress uniforms gather on the central field. Colonel Richard Smythe was 45 years old and served as the chief public relations officer for the division. He came from a wealthy banking family in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and his polished leather boots had never stepped inside a muddy foxhole or smelled the stench of a burning hull. His tailored wool overcoat was pristine, free of grease, and his silver eagles caught the dull winter sun. Smythe believed that the war effort back home depended entirely on maintaining a specific traditional image of the American military. He openly insisted to his staff that the folks in Ohio and Pennsylvania were not prepared to see black faces representing the heroic rescue of Bastogne. To him, the battlefield was a stage, the press corps was his audience, and the black soldiers who had just broken the German line were merely laborers who belonged in the background. He adjusted his pristine wool gloves, looked over his shoulder at the approaching journalists, and signaled for his assistants to clear the frame. Some historians have argued that George Patton was a man trapped in an outdated century, driven purely by the cold mechanics of battlefield victory and the preservation of rigid military order. They suggest that his decision to intervene at Bastogne was not a grand statement on racial equality, but rather a practical effort to maintain discipline and protect his own command structure from public relations interference. Others argue the opposite, claiming that Patton possessed a unique, pragmatic fairness that looked past societal prejudices to recognize raw battlefield merit whenever he saw it. What is certain is that the official photographs from that snowy field remained permanently altered. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have ignored the public relations officer to avoid a political conflict? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about when courage refused to be hidden in the shadows, make sure to subscribe.